I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to spend this quiet time with you. Share with us where you're listening from, and do you know how to sew or knit? Be sure to subscribe so you can return for a new mystery every day. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Linen Basket at the Parish Hall. The annual jumble sale of St Mary Mead was, as any long-standing resident could attest, one of those quietly reliable occasions that stitched the village calendar together as surely as thread joins two pieces of cloth. It arrived each summer with the dependability of the swallows, and it was received by the village with a mixture of industrious anticipation and barely concealed competition. Who had donated most generously? Whose cast-offs revealed an unexpected refinement of taste? These were questions that occupied certain minds for days beforehand and for days thereafter. On this particular Tuesday morning in late July, the parish hall stood open to a warm, still air that carried the faint scent of cut grass from the vicarage garden next door. The trestle tables had been erected the evening before by Mr. Hartwell and two of his nephews, and now the ladies of the village moved among them with the focused calm of women who have organised a great many things and intend to continue doing so. Garments were folded with care, crockery arranged in symmetrical rows, books sorted by apparent respectability rather than any other principle, and small ornaments placed where they might catch the eye without toppling. It was into this scene of orderly domestic industry that Miss Jane Marple arrived, shortly after 9:30, carrying a basket of her own contributions and wearing the expression of a woman who finds the world on the whole rather interesting. Miss Marple was a slight, elderly lady, with white hair set neatly beneath a summer hat of no particular fashion, pale blue eyes of considerable alertness behind gold-rimmed spectacles, and hands that were seldom still, being usually engaged with knitting, or, as this morning, the careful handling of donated articles. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for more years than she would readily specify, and she knew it, as she occasionally remarked to her niece, rather as one knows a favourite piece of embroidery. Every stitch, every small irregularity, every patch of colour that did not quite match the rest. She had been assigned, after a small and polite disagreement with Mrs. Pell, to the sorting of blouses and light outerwear, a task she accepted with equanimity and rather more attention than blouses generally receive. Mrs. Honoria Pell presided over the hall with the quiet authority of a woman who had been doing so for 11 years. She was a handsome person of 60-odd, with strong opinions, a sharp memory, and a profound attachment to the village's history that occasionally shaded into proprietorship. She had been born in St Mary Mead, had married into it again after a brief and apparently unremarkable period of residence in Shropshire, and regarded herself as its unofficial archivist in all matters of social, or architectural and sartorial record. Her opinions on what was antique and what was merely old, on what was continental and what was provincial, were not offered lightly and were not easily disputed. It was Mrs. Pell who first noticed the lace. It lay near the bottom of a large wicker basket that had been left by the door sometime between the previous evening and 9 o'clock that morning, delivered by persons unknown. Most of the basket's contents were unremarkable. Some curtain fabric, a crocheted blanket in colours that had not improved with age, and a quantity of table linens in varying states of preservation. But folded beneath these, wrapped loosely in a sheet of brown paper, was a length of lace of considerable delicacy. Mrs. Pell drew it out with both hands and held it to the light from the high windows. The pattern was intricate, the weave close and even, and the general quality of the work was, by any reasonable assessment, exceptional. It was yellowed in the way that fine old lace yellows, not from neglect but from the slow passage of decades, and the scalloped edge had the particular precision that one associated with Flemish or French work of the previous century. Valenciennes, if I am not mistaken, Mrs. Pell said, to no one in particular, though several ladies had drawn near by this point. And quite a fine example. Someone has parted with something rather valuable. What drew the eye, however, and what drew it with an unease quite distinct from admiration were the stains. Across one corner of the lace, spreading into the fine mesh of the pattern in the irregular manner of liquid absorbed long ago, were several dark marks of a deep brownish red. They had the character of old blood, not fresh, not recent, but unmistakably suggestive. There was a small silence. Miss Marple, who had approached quietly during the examination, looked at the lace with the steady, unhurried attention she gave to anything that seemed to her worth noticing. "How very curious," she said, in the mild, reflective tone she used when something was rather more than curious. The conversation that followed was conducted in lowered voices, as conversations of that sort generally are when they take place among English ladies of a certain sensibility. Mrs. Pell was firmly of the opinion that the piece had been donated without full consideration of its value, and equally firm that it could not decently be put out for public sale until its origins were better understood. Others agreed, though for different reasons. The stains were troubling. They were not the sort of thing one wished to explain casually to a purchaser. By 11 o'clock, when the sorting was well advanced and the tea urn had been filled for the second time, another matter had come to the attention of the gathering. Mrs. Adelaide Morton was not at home. This piece of intelligence arrived by way of young Mrs. Fellows, who lived 3 doors from Mrs. Morton's cottage on Wisteria Lane, and who had, that morning, walked past it twice on her way to and from the post office. The curtains had been open both times, which was correct, but there had been no smoke from the kitchen chimney, which Mrs. Morton invariably maintained until at least 10, and the milk from the previous afternoon remained on the step, which was not at all in keeping with a woman of her orderly habits. Mrs. Adelaide Morton was a widow of some 70 years, a woman of quiet manners and considerable reserve, who had lived in St. Mary Mead for the better part of 2 decades. She had come to the village upon the death of her husband, a retired civil servant of modest distinction, and had settled into it with the careful self-sufficiency of a person who values her own company without being unfriendly to others. She was known for her excellent linen collection. She had mentioned it on more than one occasion, with the subdued pride of a woman for whom such things represented both beauty and continuity, and for her habit of walking in the early morning before the rest of the village was properly awake. She had no family in the immediate vicinity, which was a fact now remarked upon with quiet significance. Miss Marple folded a pale grey blouse with particular neatness and set it to one side. She had noted the time at which the lace had been found, just after 9:30, and she noted now that Mrs. Morton's absence appeared to date from at least the previous afternoon. She said nothing immediately. It was not, she had found over a long life of observation, ever profitable to say things immediately. But she held both facts in her mind with the careful, unhurried attention that a person of knitting experience brings to a dropped stitch, locating it precisely, on understanding how it had occurred, and considering before acting exactly how it might best be retrieved. St. Mary Mead continued about its preparations. The trestle tables filled, the tea was drunk. Outside, the summer morning moved on at its customary unhurried pace, entirely indifferent to the delicate and slightly disquieting question that now hung in the warm air of the parish hall. What had Mrs. Morton done with her lace? And more to the point, where was Mrs. Morton? Chapter 2. Crimson Traces on Valenciennes. By 12:30, the sorting of donated articles had been temporarily suspended in favour of a more pressing activity, namely the careful and thoroughly enjoyable discussion of what had been found. The tea urn remained in service well beyond its usual hours, and several ladies who had fully intended to return home for luncheon found themselves still present at the parish hall, their baskets on their arms and their attention elsewhere. The lace had been placed upon a clean sheet of white cartridge paper at one end of the central table, where it lay with a certain melancholy distinction, like an exhibit at a modest but earnest museum. Mrs. Pell had produced a magnifying glass from her handbag. She was the sort of woman who carries a magnifying glass as a matter of course, and had subjected the piece to a thorough examination before delivering her conclusions with the measured gravity of someone accustomed to being listened to. "It is Valenciennes," she said for the second time that morning, as though the repetition lent the identification greater authority. "The ground is diamond mesh, which is characteristic, and the floral motif along the inner border is consistent with Belgian work of the 1880s, perhaps earlier. Whoever donated this piece either did not know its value or had very particular reasons for wishing it gone." This last observation was received with a short silence of the appreciative sort. The question of the stains was approached more cautiously. No one wished to be the first to name what the discoloration most obviously suggested, and so it was named by suggestion, by implication, and by a series of carefully incomplete sentences that nonetheless left everyone in no doubt as to the general conclusion. It was Dr. Edmund Haydock who brought the matter to a cleaner resolution, arriving at the parish hall at 1:45 in response to a telephone message that Mrs. Pell had seen fit to send before most people had finished their first cup of tea. Dr. Haydock was a man of 60, compact in build and unhurried in manner, with the comfortable authority of a country doctor who has attended to the village's ailments for long enough to know that a great many of them are not strictly medical. He had a blunt, sensible face, kind eyes behind heavy-framed spectacles, and the reliable quality of a man who says what he means without embellishment, which the village found at once reassuring and, on occasion, slightly inconvenient. He examined the stains with professional composure, so tilting the lace toward the light and then away from it, pressing a fingertip gently against the discoloured area and observing the texture with the attention of a man who is gathering information rather than forming an impression. "Old blood," he said, straightforwardly. "Long dried. I couldn't tell you how old without proper analysis, but this is not recent. Months at the very least, more probably years." He set the lace down with care. "There's no cause for immediate alarm on medical grounds, if that's what you're asking." No one had quite asked that, but the answer was appreciated nonetheless. Miss Marple, who had remained near the table throughout this examination, while appearing to be chiefly engaged with a cup of tea, observed Dr. Haydock's face as he spoke. He was not troubled, she noted. He was interested, in the measured way of a professional presented with an unusual specimen, but not troubled, and that was itself informative. The conversation that followed was the kind that moves in careful circles, each person contributing what they knew or suspected, while remaining attentive to what others might inadvertently reveal. Miss Marple participated in this conversation in her characteristic fashion, which is to say she listened with great thoroughness and spoke with apparent diffidence, offering small observations that seemed tangential until one considered them afterward. 3 people in particular made themselves known during this hour, each by a different means. The first was Mr. Stephen Garth, who arrived at the parish hall at something after 1 o'clock, ostensibly to deliver a further donation from a client's estate, but remaining rather longer than the errand required. Mr. Garth was a solicitor of middle age, precise in his dress and more precise still in his speech, a lean, a fair-haired man with the professional habit of revealing nothing by his expression that he had not chosen to reveal. He had handled Mrs. Morton's affairs for some years, a fact that was generally known in the village without being a matter of active discussion, and he expressed, upon hearing of her absence, a concern that was correctly measured and carefully worded. "I am sure there is a perfectly ordinary explanation," he said, or in the tone of a man who's not entirely sure of this but considers it the appropriate thing to say. "Mrs. Morton is a composed and capable woman. I cannot imagine she would cause anxiety without good reason." He inquired, with what seemed like professional thoroughness, whether anyone had attempted to contact her more distant relations. When told that no one had been certain who those relations were, he nodded slowly, as though filing the information away. Miss Marple noticed that he did not volunteer the information himself, though as her solicitor he was quite likely to possess it. The second person was Miss Lucinda Bray, who had been present in the hall since mid-morning, having arrived early to offer assistance with the book table. Miss Bray was a woman of perhaps 45, slight and fair, with a kind of composed prettiness that had once been more remarked upon, and now served chiefly as an agreeable background to her personality. She was a distant cousin of Mrs. Morton's, or had described herself as such upon taking up residence in the village some 8 months previously, and had become, in that time, a frequent visitor to the cottage on Wisteria Lane, bringing small gifts of preserves and sitting for what she described as companionable afternoons. Upon hearing that the lace was likely of considerable value and had been delivered anonymously, Miss Bray expressed surprise with the particular fluency of someone who has practised the expression. She didn't recognise the piece, she said. She'd seen Mrs. Morton's linen on several occasions, but could not claim any expert knowledge of it. Her cousin, she added, had grown somewhat forgetful of late, though this was said with an affectionate smile that softened the observation without quite removing it. Forgetful in small matters, she added, perhaps conscious that she had said rather more than she intended. Nothing of any significance. Miss Marple set down her teacup. The third person was Mrs. Ivy Rutledge, who required no occasion to be present, being one of those village women whose natural habitat is wherever something of interest is occurring. Mrs. Rutledge was a broad, cheerful woman of late middle age, a widow of some 12 years, and a neighbour of Mrs. Morton's, whose proximity had expanded over time into something approaching informal management of the household. She brought soup during colder months, collected parcels when Mrs. Morton was indisposed, and possessed a comprehensive knowledge of her neighbours' domestic arrangements that she shared freely, and without evident awareness that such knowledge might be considered unusual. She was, of all those present, the least restrained in her anxiety. It is not like her, Mrs. Rutledge said, on at least 3 separate occasions during the afternoon, each time with slightly greater emphasis. Not like her at all. She's a creature of habit. She does not simply go off without a word. This was said with the warmth of genuine concern, and Miss Marple had no reason to doubt that the concern was genuine. Genuine concern and other, more complicated feelings are not, in her experience, mutually exclusive. By 2 o'clock, when the hall had grown warm and the remaining ladies were beginning to speak of luncheon with some insistence, the general position was this. A valuable and stained piece of antique lace had appeared without explanation. An elderly widow of orderly habits was absent without explanation, and 3 people who each had some connection to that widow had each expressed sympathy without, as Miss Marple observed to herself, appearing genuinely alarmed. She gathered her basket and her light summer cardigan, and took her leave with the polite brevity of a woman who has somewhere to be, though in truth she intended nothing more pressing than a quiet walk home by way of Wisteria Lane. It was a fine afternoon. The roses along the garden walls of the High Street were fully open, and dropping petals onto the warm pavement in a desultory fashion. A cat of advanced years sat upon a gate-post and watched her pass without interest. Miss Marple walked slowly and thought steadily, which was for her the most productive combination available. The lace had been delivered anonymously. Mrs. Morton was absent. Mrs. Pell had said with some firmness that Mrs. Morton would never part with heirloom pieces lightly. Miss Bray had suggested forgetfulness. Mr. Garth had suggested a perfectly ordinary explanation. Mrs. Rutledge had suggested, rather more loudly than the others, distress. What none of them had suggested, Miss Marple reflected, was indifference. And yet that, of all the explanations available, was the one that the evidence might most readily support. A woman who wished to leave quietly and without fuss might, before departing, put away what she could not take with her. She might even, if she were thoughtful in a particular way, ensure that a valued piece found a home where it would be appreciated, or she might not have put it there at all. Miss Marple paused at the corner of Wisteria Lane and looked toward the cottage, which stood at the far end behind a low flint wall, its curtains open and its chimney cold in its milk bottle. She could see even from this distance still upon the step. She stood there for a moment in the pleasant afternoon light and then walked on. Chapter 3. A Cottage Door Left Unlatched. The following morning brought with it a sky of particular clarity, the kind that arrives after a warm night and settles over an English village with an air of mild self-congratulation. Miss Marple had been in her garden since 7:15, attending to a rose that had developed an unhelpful tendency to sprawl, and was therefore well placed to observe the small procession that made its way along the lane toward Wisteria Cottage at 8:30. Mrs. Rutledge led the way, which surprised no one. She walked with the purposeful step of a woman acting on accumulated anxiety, her basket over one arm and her expression communicating, even at a distance, that she had spent the night thinking matters over and had arrived at conclusions. Behind her came Miss Bray, rather more quietly dressed than on the previous day, and at a slight distance that might have suggested deference, or might have suggested the wish to be present without being first. Mr. Garth had sent word the previous evening that he would call at the cottage at 9, which was the solicitor's way of doing what others did from neighbourly concern. That is, satisfying his curiosity through a professional frame. Miss Marple set down her gardening gloves. Years told herself she had been intending to walk that way in any case, and followed at a suitable interval. The cottage stood as it had the previous afternoon, its flint wall warm in the morning sun, its small front garden tidy in the way of gardens that are maintained by habit rather than passion, the hedges clipped, the path clear, the window boxes orderly but not imaginative. The milk from the previous afternoon had been joined by that morning's delivery, both bottles standing upon the step with a patience that seemed to the observer rather eloquent. Mrs. Rutledge produced a key from her basket with the ease of a woman accustomed to its use, and this was the first detail that Miss Marple, arriving at the gate as the door swung open, found worth setting aside for future consideration. Access to a neighbour's cottage by personal arrangement is a commonplace kindness. A key produced without remark, in the presence of others, suggests an arrangement of some duration and considerable intimacy. The interior of the cottage did not immediately declare itself a scene of alarm. That, in itself, was informative. The front hall was cool and dim, with the particular quality of a house that has been closed for a day or two. Not stale, precisely, but still in the way that rooms become still when they are no longer being lived in. A coat hung on the rack by the door. An umbrella stood in its stand. The floor was clean, and a small table by the wall held a silver card tray containing 3 letters, addressed and sealed, with stamps affixed, which had evidently been waiting to be posted. Miss Bray picked up the letters and examined the addresses before setting them down again, which was done quickly enough that the action might have passed unremarked. Miss Marple remarked it. The sitting-room presented the same quality of arrested orderliness. A shawl of soft grey wool was folded over the arm of the larger chair with the precision of someone who folds things as a matter of character rather than occasion. Upon the small table beside it lay an open book, a slim volume of devotional verse, with a pair of spectacles resting across the open pages, as though Mrs. Morton had set them down expecting to return within the hour. "She has not been here since Tuesday morning," Mrs. Rutledge said. It is with the authority of a woman whose knowledge of her neighbours' domestic rhythms was detailed enough to support such a conclusion. "The hearth has not been laid since Tuesday. She always lays it the evening before, whatever the season, out of habit, and her walking shoes are here." She indicated, by a glance, a pair of stout leather shoes beside the door to the kitchen. She would not have gone far without those. This was observed by all present and produced a brief reflective silence. Miss Bray moved through the room with the quiet attentiveness of someone reacquainting herself with familiar surroundings. She paused at the writing desk in the corner, a pleasant piece of old mahogany, rather better than the rest of the furniture, and ran her fingers lightly along its surface without opening it. "She mentioned," she said in a conversational tone that was slightly too carefully calibrated to be entirely casual, that she had been thinking of visiting some people in Dorset. Old friends. She may simply have gone without thinking to tell anyone. "Without her walking shoes?" Mrs. Rutledge replied, with a dryness she did not bother to moderate. Miss Bray smiled, which was the appropriate response, and said nothing further on the subject. It was at this point that Miss Marple asked, in the diffident way she had when she was asking something she had already answered for herself, whether the upstairs rooms might not also be worth a look, and purely for the reassurance of finding everything in order. Mrs. Rutledge, who required no encouragement, led the way. The bedroom confirmed the pattern. The bed had been made with care. A nightgown lay folded on the pillow. The dressing table held its usual complement of articles: a brush and comb of silver plate, a small pot of cold cream, a modest collection of the kind of jewellery that is worn out of habit rather than vanity. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing, as far as could be determined, had been taken. In the wardrobe the clothes hung as they should. A coat was present, 2-day dresses, a good wool suit, and the various accessories of a woman of Mrs. Morton's age and station. One space, Miss Marple noted, was unoccupied, a gap between a dark blue dress and a heavier winter coat, approximately the width of a garment that was not there. Whether it had ever been there was impossible to say. Beneath the stairs, Mrs. Rutledge showed the others the cedar-lined chest she had mentioned once or twice in conversation as the home of Mrs. Morton's better household linens. It was large and well made, its brass fittings polished, and when opened it exhaled the mingled scents of cedar and camphor in the measured way of chests that have been properly maintained over a long period of time. The contents, layers of folded linen carefully interleaved with tissue, were undisturbed, immaculate, and precisely what one would expect of a woman who took such things seriously. There was no blood-stained lace. There was, in fact, no lace of any particular distinction, which was a small absence that Miss Marple found considerably more suggestive than a presence would have been. Mr. Garth arrived as the party reassembled in the hall, punctual to his word. He accepted the summary of their findings with an expression of thoughtful gravity, and remarked, as he had the day before, that he was confident there was an ordinary explanation. He moved through the sitting-room without appearing to search it, and yet covered the ground thoroughly enough that a less composed observer might have found the efficiency slightly conspicuous. "The letters," he said, noticing the card tray. He did not pick them up. "Have those been there since Tuesday?" "I couldn't say," Mrs. Rutledge replied. "I don't generally notice the correspondence." A small untruth, Miss Marple suspected, though an understandable one. She herself said very little throughout the inspection. She examined what was available to examine and listened to what was said and to what was left unsaid, and she noted as she made her way back along the lane toward home that 3 people who each claimed concern had each, in their own manner, found an opportunity to look for something specific without appearing to do so. Mrs. Rutledge had gone directly to the linen chest. Miss Bray had paused at the writing desk. Mr. Garth had noticed the letters. None of them had found what they were looking for. Miss Marple was fairly certain of that. Their expressions upon leaving the cottage, politely inconclusive, uniformly unsatisfied, had told her as much. The mystery of Mrs. Morton's absence remained unresolved, but the question of who might be most affected by what she had done with her affairs before departing had become, or Miss Marple reflected as she unlatched her own garden gate, a good deal clearer. She would think it over with her knitting, which was where she did her best thinking, and which had the additional advantage of appearing to be nothing of the sort. Chapter 4. Polite Remarks over Lemon Sponge. The gathering at Mrs. Fellowes' house on Thursday afternoon was not, strictly speaking, organised with the Morton matter in mind. It had been arranged the previous week as a modest birthday celebration for Mrs. Fellowes' sister, who was visiting from Exeter and who had expressed a wish for lemon sponge, which Mrs. Fellowes made with some distinction. There were 7 ladies present, which was a comfortable number for a sitting-room of that size, and the conversation for the first half-hour concerned the sisters' journey, the unreliability of the branch line, and a brief but spirited discussion of whether the new postmistress sorted parcels with adequate care. It was inevitable, however, that the conversation should find its way to Mrs. Morton. In a village of St. Mary Mead's dimensions, an absence of 3 days' duration without explanation is not a subject that remains peripheral for long. By the time the second slice of sponge had been distributed, the room had settled into that particular mode of collective attention that English ladies of a certain social latitude deploy when a matter requires thorough examination under the guise of idle chat. Miss Marple had been invited as a matter of course, being on comfortable terms with Mrs. Fellowes. and she sat in the chair nearest the window with her knitting, a pair of gloves in pale wool for her great niece, moving steadily between her fingers. She had found, over many years, that knitting provided two distinct advantages in a social gathering. It gave her hands an occupation that freed her attention for listening, and it gave others the impression that her attention was only partially engaged, which frequently resulted in their saying rather more than they might otherwise have chosen to. Mrs. Pell, also present, opened the subject with the brisk precision of a woman who sees no reason to circle what she intends to say. "I have made inquiries," she announced, setting down her cup, "regarding the lace. I have consulted the parish records for the years 1887 through 1895, and I believe I have found something of relevance." She paused, in the way of a person who has prepared their moment. There is an entry in the records of St. Bartholomew's, which was the parish of Upper Fenwick before the boundary revision, that describes, among the effects donated following a death, a bridal veil of Belgian lace with a scalloped border. The family name given is Radstock. This produced a murmur of interest from those present, and a small private alertness in Miss Marple, who continued knitting at exactly the same pace. "Radstock," said Mrs. Rutledge, with a slow recognition of someone locating a familiar word in an unexpected context. "Was that not Adelaide Morton's name before she married? I had thought her a Radstock or something very like it." "It was," said Mrs. Pell, with the satisfaction of a scholar whose footnote has been vindicated. The implications of this settled over the room in a comfortable silence. Mrs. Morton, it appeared, had some historical connection to the lace that went beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. The piece was not simply a fine antique from her collection. It was, or appeared to be, a family article. A bridal veil, furthermore, which lent it a quality of personal significance that plain table linen could not have possessed. It was Mrs. Rutledge who moved the conversation in the direction that interested Miss Marple most. "She did speak once," Mrs. Rutledge said, in the reflective manner of someone retrieving a memory that had not previously seemed important, "of a young man, in her past, before Mr. Morton, I mean. She mentioned it only the once, and she did not go into particulars, but the impression I had was that it had not ended happily. Something she said about youthful expectations and the wisdom of accepting how things turn out. Not bitter, you understand, simply resigned." Miss Bray, seated near the fireplace with her hands folded in her lap, and said, "She never spoke of such things to me." This was offered without evident feeling, but it had the character of a remark that occupies more space than its words suggest, as though the absence of such confidences were a thing that had been noted. "People speak of different things to different people," Miss Marple observed pleasantly without looking up from her knitting. "One rarely tells the whole of oneself to any single acquaintance. We're all rather like, oh, I think of those old houses with rooms that are used and rooms that are kept closed. One may know a house very well and still not have seen every room." This was received as the mild, digressive observation it appeared to be. Miss Bray smiled politely. Mrs. Pell returned to her records. "The entry," Mrs. Pell continued, opening a small notebook she had produced from her bag, "refers to a donation made in September of 1888, which was following the death of a Miss Eleanor Radstock. Who was Adelaide Morton's aunt? The veil is described as having been set aside prior to a marriage that did not take place, and donated in lieu of being returned." "A broken engagement," said Mrs. Fellowes' sister from Exeter, who had been listening with undisguised interest and the license of a visitor who has no local reputation to moderate. "And the blood?" "That," said Mrs. Pell, closing her notebook, "the records do not explain. Dr. Haydock had mentioned, when prevailed upon for a second opinion the previous day, that old blood on fabric might result from any number of causes far less dramatic than violence. A minor injury, a cut finger, a domestic mishap of the most ordinary kind." Miss Marple had thanked him for this information and thought privately that he was quite right, and that this did not in any way diminish the interest of the Staines. A thing can be ordinarily explained and still be worth understanding. The question of Mrs. Morton's intentions toward her estate surfaced about 20 minutes later, as such questions tend to surface in gatherings of this kind, sideways through apparent association in the voice of someone who has been waiting for a natural opportunity. "She mentioned to me," said Miss Bray carefully, "that she had been giving some thought to her arrangements. She used that word, arrangements, as she felt that certain provisions she had made some years ago no longer reflected her present wishes." The room received this with the particular stillness of people in whom a significant remark has just landed. "I see," said Mrs. Pell, who saw a great deal. She did not go into detail, Miss Bray added, with the precision of someone placing a boundary around information they have chosen to offer, only that she was considering the matter. Miss Marple wound a length of wool around her needle with calm deliberation. Mr. Garth, she recalled, had been equally careful at the cottage when the subject of Mrs. Morton's affairs arose. Miss Bray was equally careful now. There was a particular quality to the carefulness of both, which was not evasion precisely, but rather the management of proximity to something they each preferred to approach from a controlled angle. Mrs. Rutledge, who was less given to control, said, with blunt warmth, she was a generous woman. Whatever she decided, it would have been thought over properly. She was not impulsive. "No," agreed Miss Marple, "she does not sound it. A woman who lays her hearth every evening whatever the season, and who folds her shawl in a particular way, and who keeps heirloom lace in cedar-lined chests. Such a woman makes her decisions with care, I should think, and does not arrive at them quickly." There was a small pause, and then Mrs. Fellows offered more sponge, and the conversation moved with its natural English instinct toward pleasanter ground. But Miss Marple sat with the new information arranged quietly in her mind, adding itself to what she already held. The lace had been a bridal veil connected to an engagement that had not proceeded. The stains on it were old. The provenance ran through Mrs. Morton's family, through an aunt's bequest, and therefore into the particular history of a woman who had eventually married someone else and lived a composed and ordered life in St. Mary Mead for 20 years, without speaking much of what had come before. People carry the past with them in different ways, Miss Marple reflected. Some carry it openly, as one carries a walking stick, visibly, usefully, with no particular shame. Others fold it away in cedar-lined chests and close the lid, and do not open it except in private. And on occasions when it becomes necessary to decide what, in the end, should be done with it. She finished the thumb of the left glove as the party began to arrange itself for departure, and thought that a visit to the county archive, where auction records were kept, might prove a profitable way to spend a Friday morning. The lemon sponge had been, as promised, excellent. Chapter 5. A cuff box beneath the stairs. Friday morning arrived with a light mist that dissolved before 8 o'clock, leaving the village in a state of pleasant freshness that made even routine errands feel like small excursions. Miss Marple had intended to set off for the county archive in Milverley by the 10 o'clock bus, but events intervened in the mild, persistent manner that events in a village of St. Mary Mead's temperament frequently do. Mrs. Rutledge appeared at the garden gate at 9:15, wearing an expression that combined purposefulness with a degree of discomfort not entirely accounted for by the earliness of the hour. "I have been thinking," she said, when Miss Marple had brought her inside and settled her in the sitting-room with a cup of tea, "about the cedar chest." Miss Marple waited, which was generally the most productive thing to do when Mrs. Rutledge was preparing to say something. "When we looked inside it on Wednesday," Mrs. Rutledge continued, setting her cup down with care, "I did not mention something. I am not sure why I did not mention it. I suppose I thought it was not relevant, or I was not certain what it meant, or—" She paused in the manner of someone aware that their reasons, examined in sequence, do not entirely convince. "In any case, I didn't mention it, and I have since concluded that I ought to." She explained that in the weeks prior to Mrs. Morton's disappearance she had been admitted to the cottage on 2 occasions to assist with the cleaning of the upstairs rooms, which Mrs. Morton found increasingly difficult to manage alone. On the second of these occasions, a Thursday some 3 weeks past, she had come upon Mrs. Morton in the hallway beneath the stairs, kneeling before the cedar chest with its lid open. Mrs. Morton had heard her approach and had closed the chest rather quickly. "Not with alarm, Mrs." Rutledge was careful to say, but with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided upon a particular action and wishes to complete it privately. "She said she was tidying," Mrs. Rutledge said, "and I accepted that, because there was no reason not to. But when I looked in the chest on Wednesday, I noticed something that I think was not there before." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "There was a small box," Mrs. Rutledge said, "covered in green leather. The kind one keeps cufflinks in, or small items of that sort. I had not seen it in the chest before, and I was in a position to notice, because I had helped Adelaide fold and store the winter table linen in that chest not 6 weeks prior, and there was no green leather box at that time. It was sitting in the corner beneath the first layer of linen." "You did not open it?" "I did not." Mrs. Rutledge straightened slightly, in the manner of a woman drawing a line. "It was not my box to open." This distinction, Miss Marple reflected, was an interesting one, given that Mrs. Rutledge had opened the chest itself without apparent hesitation. But it was not, on reflection, an inconsistency. There is a certain kind of woman for whom the management of another person's household is an extension of helpfulness rather than intrusion, and who nonetheless draws precise and sincere limits at anything that feels like genuine trespass. Mrs. Rutledge was of that kind, and Miss Marple respected the distinction even as she noted it. "The box is still there, presumably," Miss Marple said, "unless someone has moved it since Wednesday." Mrs. Rutledge looked at her directly. "Mr. Garth went back to the cottage yesterday afternoon. He mentioned to Mrs. Fellows that he needed to take an inventory of certain items for the purposes of his professional responsibilities. I am not sure exactly what was meant by that." Miss Marple was not sure either, although she had a reasonable suspicion. They returned to Wisteria Cottage together, Mrs. Rutledge using her key with the same unstudied familiarity as before. The morning light entered the hall at a different angle than it had 2 days prior, illuminating the dust on the surface of the small table by the wall. Not much dust, but enough to indicate that no one had polished it since Tuesday. The letters in the card tray were still present, which was either reassuring or simply the result of no one having thought to post them. The cedar chest, when opened, exhaled its familiar compound of cedar and camphor into the cool air of the hall. The layers of folded linen lay as before, undisturbed in their tissue wrappings, the top layer slightly less precisely aligned than it had been on Wednesday, as though it had been lifted and replaced in haste. The green leather box was in the corner beneath the first fold of linen, is exactly where Mrs. Rutledge had said. It was a handsome small thing, dark green with gilt edging, of the sort produced in quantities during the latter part of the previous century, for the storage of modest personal effects. Its surface was worn at the corners in a way that suggested both age and regular handling. Miss Marple lifted it out and opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of ivory silk that had yellowed to cream, lay a small quantity of lace. Not a length, as the jumble sale piece had been, but a fragment, 3 or 4 inches of a border pattern, cut clean at both ends, which corresponded in its weave and in the character of its floral motif precisely with the Valenciennes piece currently resting on white cartridge paper at the parish hall. It was beyond reasonable doubt from the same original article, and it was, Miss Marple observed with close attention, entirely without stain. She sat with this information for a moment, the box in her lap and the small fragment of lace held up to the light from the hall window. The implications arranged themselves with the orderly patience of things that have been waiting to be considered. The jumble sale lace bore staining across one corner. This fragment, evidently cut from the same piece and stored in the cedar chest, bore none. If the staining had occurred to the veil as a whole, one would expect to find traces consistent across the fabric. The fact that only the larger piece was marked, and the fragment in the box was not, suggested one of 2 things. Either the staining had been applied to the larger piece after the separation of the fragment, or the fragment had been cut specifically from an unstained portion, which would indicate that someone had been selective. Neither explanation was simple. Both were interesting. Miss Marple replaced the fragment in its box and set the box back in its corner beneath the first layer of linen, resettling the tissue with care. What she had seen was now her own information to consider, and she was not yet ready to share it. Experience had taught her that information shared too early becomes the property of whoever hears it, and does not always remain useful to the person who found it. Mrs. Rutledge, who had stood to one side during this examination with the restraint of someone who wishes very much to ask questions and has decided against it, broke her silence only as the chest was being closed. "Is it significant?" "I think it may be," Miss Marple said, "though not in the way one might first suppose." She stood, smoothed her skirt and looked around the hall with the comprehensive but undemonstrative attention that took in the letters on the table, the coat on the rack, and the continued absence of any sign that the cottage's owner had any intention of returning imminently. "The lace in the jumble sale bundle," she said, as they let themselves out into the morning, "is the larger portion of the veil. The fragment in the box was cut from it and stored separately. The staining exists on one and not the other." She paused on the garden path to admire with genuine appreciation a climbing rose that had found its way over the flint wall and produced 3 late blooms of a very pleasing deep pink. What that means, exactly, I'm not yet certain, but I find it difficult to believe that it happened by accident. The mist had entirely gone. The lane was warm and quiet, and a blackbird was conducting a thorough investigation of the grass verge 30 yards distant. Mrs. Rutledge walked beside Miss Marple without speaking, which was a form of consideration she was not always able to manage, and which Miss Marple appreciated accordingly. The county archive, Miss Marple decided, could wait until Monday. She had enough to think about for the present, and thinking, in her experience, required a degree of patience that was not always compatible with an early bus. Besides, the archive would keep. Auction records, once entered, had the considerable virtue of not changing their story between one visit and the next. Chapter 6. Measured Glances Across the Green. The weekend passed in the way that summer weekends in St. Mary Mead customarily pass, with the appearance of leisure and the reality of a great deal of quiet industry. Gardens were attended to, correspondence written, cold suppers eaten on garden benches as the evening stretched long and golden toward their close. The jumble sale itself took place on Saturday morning with its usual modest success, the donated articles finding new homes with the brisk efficiency that characterizes transactions conducted for charitable ends, where the social value of participation outweighs the commercial consideration of price. The Valenciennes lace did not appear among the items for sale. Mrs. Pell had seen to that, removing it to a place of safekeeping with the decisive authority of a woman who considers certain objects too significant for the common trestle table. Whether her reasons were aesthetic, historical, or of a more proprietary character, she did not precisely specify, and no one felt sufficiently confident to inquire. By Sunday afternoon, the village had settled into that particular after-sale calm that follows the conclusion of a collective enterprise. The hall had been cleared, the trestle tables returned to the shed, and the ladies of the organising committee were at liberty to turn their full attention back to the matter of Mrs. Morton, which several of them had never entirely turned away from. Miss Marple spent Sunday morning at church and Sunday afternoon at her sitting-room window, which afforded a partial view of the lane and the upper end of the village green, and which she had found over many years to be a vantage point of considerable social utility. She was knitting the second glove when she observed, at 3:30, something that she noted without making any immediate alteration to the pace of her needles. Mr. Garth and Miss Bray were crossing the green together. This was not in itself remarkable. The village green was a public amenity, and the use of it by two acquaintances simultaneously required no explanation. What gave Miss Marple pause was not the fact of their crossing it together, but the character of the crossing. They walked at a pace that suggested consultation rather than coincidence. their conversation conducted at a volume and with an attention to proximity that indicated a degree of mutual confidence not previously displayed in more public settings. They paused near the old elm at the centre of the green, where a wooden bench offered a degree of seclusion from the lane, though not from Miss Marple's window, which they had either not considered or had considered sufficiently distant to discount. They spoke for some 12 minutes, and during which time Miss Bray's posture suggested something between anxiety and appeal, and Mr. Garth suggested the careful management of a professional who is being asked to do something that requires thought. They parted with the slight awkwardness of people who have reached an incomplete conclusion and went in opposite directions. Miss Marple finished the finger she was working on, counted her stitches, and reflected that a solicitor and a potential beneficiary conducting a private discussion on a Sunday afternoon, in the absence of the client who connected them, was the sort of thing that one might explain innocently enough, and yet which nevertheless warranted a small mark in the margin of one's understanding. Monday morning she took the 9:15 bus to Milverley. The county archive occupied the ground floor of a building that had formerly housed the magistrate's court, and retained from that period a quality of institutional patience, as though accustomed to waiting for matters to resolve themselves in their own time. The reading room was cool and smelled pleasantly of old paper, and the assistant who received Miss Marple's request for auction records from the relevant decades was a young man of obliging disposition, who found what she needed with gratifying efficiency. The catalogues were large, bound in brown cloth, and organised by year and by the name of the auctioneer's house. Miss Marple worked through them with the methodical pleasure of a woman who genuinely enjoys documentary research, and does not consider it a lesser activity than any other form of inquiry. She found what she was looking for in the third volume. A sale conducted in September of 1903 by the firm of Aldridge and Pemberton of Milverley included, among the contents of a private estate, an entry reading Flemish lace veil, a late 19th century, Belgian work, scalloped border, floral interior, in good condition. Lot 47. The lot had been sold, the records indicated, to a private purchaser for a sum that suggested the buyer had valued it appropriately. But it was the pencilled annotation in the margin, made in a hand different from the auctioneer's neat commercial script, that interested Miss Marple considerably more. It read simply, "Withdrawn. Reclaimed by vendor prior to sale." Beneath this, in the same pencilled hand, a name, Radstock. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. The veil had been entered for sale in 1903, had been withdrawn before the bidding reached it, and had been reclaimed by a member of the Radstock family, which was to say, by someone connected to Adelaide Morton's family line, in the years before Adelaide Morton had married and removed herself to the village life she subsequently occupied. She thought of what Mrs. Pell had said. That Mrs. Morton would never part with heirloom pieces lightly. And she thought of what Mrs. Rutledge had reported concerning a young man and youthful expectations. She thought of the veil as it had appeared on the parish hall table, its yellow delicacy and its stubborn stain, and she thought of the clean fragment in the green leather box, cut from the same fabric and stored separately with the care of something preserved rather than forgotten. What she did not yet know was the reason for the withdrawal. A piece entered for sale and then reclaimed might indicate any number of things: a change of heart, a change of circumstance, a disagreement over value. Or it might indicate something more particular, more personal, more connected to the kind of history that a composed woman keeps in a cedar-lined chest and does not discuss with neighbours. She made a note of the lot number and the date, thanked the young archivist with the sincere appreciation of one researcher for another, and took the midday bus back to St. Mary Mead. The afternoon brought with the mild inevitability of village life a further development. Rumour had reached, by means that Miss Marple did not trouble to trace, the information that Mrs. Morton had been intending to revise her will. This was not the careful, contained suggestion that Miss Bray had offered at Mrs. Fellow's gathering, a brief mention of arrangements under review. This was something more specific, circulating in the way that specific things circulate in villages, arriving at each new pair of ears with an additional degree of certainty acquired somewhere in transit. The substance of it, as Miss Marple received it from Mrs. Fellows, who had it from the woman at the wool shop, who had it from a source that remained agreeably vague, was this. Mrs. Morton had visited Mr. at Garth's office some 10 days prior to her disappearance, and had indicated that she wished to make alterations to provisions that had stood unchanged for several years. Mr. Garth, as was entirely proper, had confirmed nothing to anyone, but his clerk was a young woman of sociable instincts, and the wool shop, as Miss Marple had long observed, was a remarkably effective clearinghouse for information of all kinds. The practical consequence of this rumour was a subtle but perceptible shift in the atmosphere surrounding the three principal figures. Miss Bray appeared at the post office that afternoon with a slightly overcomposed expression of someone making ordinary purchases with rather more care than ordinary purchases require. Mrs. Rutledge, encountered near the butcher's, spoke of Mrs. Morton with an increased warmth that had about it the faint quality of a person reminding an invisible audience of their long loyalty. And Mr. Garth was not seen in the village at all, which was, Miss Marple reflected, the solicitor's most eloquent available statement. She bought a small quantity of grey wool at the wool shop because she required it, and because the wool shop repaid a visit, and walked home by the longer route that took her past the upper end of the green. The elm stood as it always stood, broad and unhurried, its shadow falling across the bench where Mr. Garth and Miss Bray had paused the previous afternoon. The bench was empty now. A pigeon occupied it briefly, decided against it, and departed. Miss Marple walked on, thinking about the auction catalogue and the pencilled annotation, and the particular quality of a thing that is withdrawn from sale at the last moment, and wondering, as she turned into her own lane, what it is that makes a person reach out at the final hour and take back what they had briefly considered letting go. Chapter 7. The Auction Catalogue with an Omission. Tuesday brought a letter. Miss Marple found it among the usual morning correspondence. A note from her niece in London, a circular from the Horticultural Society regarding the autumn bulb order, and a plain envelope addressed in a hand she did not immediately recognise, bearing a Milverley postmark and no return address. She opened it last, which was her custom with unfamiliar correspondence, and read it twice before setting it on the breakfast table beside her tea. It was from the young archivist at the County Archive, whose name, she now saw at the bottom of the page, was Mr. Thomas Hebb. He had, he wrote, continued to think about the research inquiry she had made the previous morning, and had subsequently located, in the process of routine catalogue maintenance, a second reference she might find of interest. He had taken the liberty of writing directly, as he felt it might save her the trouble of a second visit, and he hoped she would not find the forwardness of the gesture objectionable. Miss Marple found it entirely the reverse of objectionable. She poured herself a second cup of tea and read the relevant portion of Mr. Hebb's letter with close attention. The second reference pertained to a sale conducted 8 years after the one she had examined, 1911, by the same firm of Aldridge and Pemberton. Among the lots entered was a description of an item that Mr. Hebb believed corresponded from its description to the same piece: Flemish lace veil, scalloped Belgian floral motif, 19th century origin, presented for sale by a private vendor. This entry had not been annotated in the margin. It had, however, been omitted from the printed sale catalogue entirely, appearing only in the handwritten preparatory ledger that preceded the final catalogue, and from which, for reasons unrecorded, as certain lots were periodically removed before the catalogue went to press. The lot had therefore not been sold. Its omission from the printed catalogue was absolute. It appeared in no record available to a purchaser attending the sale or consulting the catalogue afterward. Only the preparatory ledger, which was a working document rather than a public one, retained the entry. Mr. Hebb had noted the date of the preparatory ledger entry, which was June of 1911, and had noted that no corresponding entry existed in the auctioneer's payment records, which confirmed that no sale had taken place. He had also noted, with the careful discretion of a young man who understood that he was passing along information of a delicate character, that the vendor's name given in the preparatory ledger was not Radstock, but a name she would recognise: Morton. Miss Marple sat for some time after finishing the letter. Outside, a blackbird was moving through the flower beds with the proprietary confidence of a creature that has established tenure, and the morning light was making the usual excellent work of the garden, which was at its summer peak, and deserved more admiration than she presently had attention to give it. Mrs. Morton, then, or whoever had entered the lot under that name, which would have required that she already bore it, meaning that the entry post dated her marriage, had attempted to sell the veil a second time in 1911 through the same firm, and had again withdrawn it before the sale. Not by annotated marginal notation this time, but by the more thorough means of removal from the printed record itself. 2 attempts to release the veil, 2 retreats. Whatever the lace represented, and it had become clear enough by now that it represented something considerably more personal than a decorative article, it was evidently something that Mrs. Morton had returned to at intervals, considered letting go of, and each time found herself unable to relinquish. That was the behaviour, Miss Marple thought, not of a woman who had forgotten something, but of one who had not yet decided what to do with a memory. She wrote a brief and warmly appreciative reply to Mr. Hebb, sealed it, and added it to the letters waiting in the hall. The question that now presented itself was a more immediate one. The staining on the veil, which Dr. Haydock had confirmed as old blood of indeterminate age, had been the original source of alarm. The assumption, never stated with confidence but clearly present in the room at the parish hall on the first morning, had been that it might indicate recent misfortune. So this assumption had diminished in plausibility with each passing day, as no body had been found, no outcry raised, and Mrs. Morton's cottage continued to sit in its orderly silence, with its milk bottles and its folded shawl, and its letters waiting to be posted. But the staining had served a purpose regardless of its origin. It had drawn attention. It had provoked inquiry. It had caused the jumble sale bundle to be removed from ordinary circulation, and subjected to the kind of scrutiny that a plain and unstained piece of donated linen would never have received. Miss Marple considered this not as a coincidence but as a mechanism. She considered who might have wished to draw attention to the lace, and why, and at what particular moment. She was engaged in this consideration, and in the more physical occupation of dead-heading the roses along the front border, when Mrs. Pell appeared at the gate with the bearing of a woman who has made a discovery and has been hospitable enough to bring it directly to the person she believes will appreciate it most. "I have found something," Mrs. Pell announced, "in the parish records for Upper Fenwick, a second entry, which I had not initially examined because it fell outside the years I had originally searched." Miss Marple set down her gardening scissors and invited her in. Mrs. Pell's second entry was from 1911, the same year as the preparatory ledger at Aldridge and Pemberton. It was an entry in the vestry accounts of St. Bartholomew's, Upper Fenwick, recording a small donation received from a Mrs. Adelaide Morton, described as being in memory of Miss Eleanor Radstock. The donation itself was modest. What accompanied it, recorded in the incumbent's personal notes rather than the official accounts, was a remark. Mrs. Morton called to inquire about the family memorial tablet, expressed a wish to add an inscription, and mentioned that she'd been in the district to attend to certain personal matters, including what she described as a long-postponed reckoning with some old effects. A long-postponed reckoning, Miss Marple repeated softly, which was the same year she attempted, if your archive research is correct, to sell the veil a second time. Mrs. Pell sat forward in her chair with the bright, discontained energy of a scholar whose threads are converging. She came back to Upper Fenwick to settle something. She attempted to put the veil into the sale. She did not in the end, and she donated to the church in memory of her aunt, whose veil it had originally been. The aunt who had also been unable to let it go, Miss Marple said, since the veil was in the family's possession at the time of the aunt's death, which suggests the aunt had not released it either. They sat with the accumulated weight of this for a moment. "It is rather a sorrowful sort of object," Mrs. Pell said, with the first indication of unguarded feeling she had displayed throughout the inquiry, for all its beauty. Many beautiful things are, Miss Marple agreed without sentimentality. A great deal of human feeling gets attached to fabric, I've always thought, more than we generally acknowledge. We wrap ourselves in cloth from birth, and we send the dead away in it, and in between those occasions we keep certain pieces for reasons we cannot always precisely articulate. The staining, she was now fairly confident, had nothing to do with Mrs. Morton's disappearance, which had its own separate and rather more prosaic explanation forming at the back of her mind. The staining had its origin in something older, an incident connected to the Vale's first history, the broken engagement. Giz's the retreats from sale, the long and unresolved attachment to an object that had outlasted the occasion for which it was made. What it had to do with the present situation was a different and more particular question. And that question, Miss Marple thought, could not be answered from the parish records or the archive ledgers. It would need to be answered by a person who was very familiar with the cedar chest beneath the stairs, and with the habits of the woman who kept it. She thought of camphor and cedar, and the particular way that Mrs. Rutledge had gone directly to the chest on the morning of the cottage inspection, with the ease of someone who had done so many times before. She thought she would call on Mrs. Rutledge tomorrow morning, and she thought she would do so alone. Chapter 8. Camphor and cedarwood. Mrs. Rutledge lived in a house that suited her in the way that certain houses and certain people suit one another, not through any particular elegance of arrangement, but through a kind of accumulated correspondence between inhabitant and dwelling that time and habit produce. The sitting-room was warm and slightly crowded, its surfaces occupied by photographs, small ornaments, and the practical detritus of a woman who does a great deal and keeps the evidence of it close to hand. A pair of gardening gloves lay on the window seat beside a ball of garden twine. A library book was open on the arm of the sofa, its place held by a folded envelope. Dried flowers hung from a hook near the kitchen door, their scent mingling with the background note of something baked earlier in the morning. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30, and was admitted with the unreserved warmth of a woman who genuinely enjoys company, though the warmth was accompanied, Miss Marple noticed, by a fraction of a second's assessment at the door, a small pause before the smile fully established itself, that suggested Mrs. Rutledge had been wondering whether this call might come. They sat with tea and a plate of shortbread that Mrs. Rutledge produced without fuss, and they talked, as was natural, about Mrs. Morton. They had talked about little else for the better part of a week, and the subject had by now the comfortable familiarity of one that has been turned over sufficiently to feel less alarming than it had initially. Miss Marple began, as she often did, at an angle. "I have been thinking," she said, with the reflective air of someone pursuing a private train of thought, aloud rather than addressing a specific inquiry, "about the cedar chest, and about how one acquires the habit of certain domestic practices. I have a chest of my own, you know, for the winter blankets, and I find I'm quite particular about what goes into it and how it is arranged. It becomes a kind of order one maintains almost without thinking." Mrs. Rutledge agreed that this was so, and spoke with some animation about her own storage habits, which were, it emerged, considerable in their thoroughness. "Mrs. Morton," she said, "I'm moving naturally toward the subject that both of them understood to be the point, was the same, precise about everything that went into that chest. The tissue paper always laid a certain way, the heavier pieces at the bottom, the more delicate ones above. She had very clear ideas about it." "And the camphor," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I noticed it rather strongly when the chest was opened. A very particular quality of camphor. Not the commercial sort one buys at the chemist's, but older. The kind one associates with real mothballs of the traditional variety." Mrs. Rutledge nodded. "She had a supply of it, kept it in a small tin at the side of the chest, said it was better than anything modern for the finer fabrics." She paused as though something had occurred to her. "I use the same sort myself, as it happens. I brought her some, the last time I ordered a supply, about a month ago." "How very kind," Miss Marple said. There was a small silence that was not uncomfortable, and during which Miss Marple drank her tea, and Mrs. Rutledge turned the handle of her own cup in a slow, absent rotation that suggested a mind occupied elsewhere. "You wrapped the jumble sale bundle yourself, I think," Miss Marple said, in the same pleasant conversational tone she had used throughout. It was not a question precisely, though it served the function of one. Mrs. Rutledge set her cup down. She did not look alarmed, which was itself informative. She looked, rather, like someone who has been half expecting a door to open, and now that it has, finds the prospect of what lies beyond it less terrible than the anticipation. "I did," she said after a moment. "Yes." Miss Marple waited. "I want to explain," Mrs. Rutledge said, "properly. Not because I expect to be excused, but because it was not done out of malice. I want that understood." "I had not supposed it was," Miss Marple said, with complete sincerity. What Mrs. Rutledge explained in the careful, slightly halting way of a woman who has rehearsed something and finds that the rehearsed version does not quite fit the reality of being heard, was this. She had known for some weeks that Mrs. Morton was reconsidering her will. This knowledge had not come from any indiscretion on Mrs. Morton's part, but from the accumulation of small signs that 12 years of close domestic proximity made legible. A certain quality of preoccupation, a remark about fairness left incomplete, the visit from Mr. A Garth that had lasted longer than a routine appointment, the way Mrs. Morton had looked at her once, across the kitchen table, with an expression that combined affection and trouble in a proportion that Mrs. Rutledge had found difficult to interpret and impossible to ignore. She was not named in the will. She had never been led to believe she would be. But she had, over the years of soup-bringing and parcel collecting and cedar chest lining and camphor sourcing, or allowed herself to develop a hope that was not spoken and not entirely examined, and that hope had taken sufficient root to make the prospect of its disappointment more acute than she found comfortable to acknowledge. When Miss Bray had arrived in the village 8 months prior, establishing herself as a cousin, and installing herself in Mrs. Morton's afternoons with her preserves and her companionable manner, Mrs. Rutledge had noticed a shift in the household's balance that she had not welcomed and had not voiced. "I was afraid," she said, with the plainness of someone who has given up softening. "Not of anything specific, just afraid of being overlooked, of having it all amount to nothing." The bundle for the jumble sale had been her own composition. She had taken the veil from the cedar chest. She had a key, as had been established, and had been admitted freely to the cottage on many occasions, and had carried it home, where she had wrapped it in brown paper, along with the curtain fabric and the crocheted blanket, and the other items she had set aside for donation. She had added the veil to the bundle not with any clear intention, but with the impulse of a person who wishes to create a situation without quite knowing what they want the situation to produce. The camphor clinging to the bundle was from her own supply, the same sort she had brought to Mrs. Morton, which she had not thought about at the time, and which she now regarded as a considerable oversight on the part of her agitation. She had not, she said, and Miss Marple believed her entirely, placed the staining deliberately. The staining was already on the veil when she took it from the chest. She had noticed it, and had not examined it closely, being too preoccupied with the larger question of what she was doing and why. "I thought," she said, looking at her hands, "that if there were an inquiry, if people looked into Adelaide's affairs, then perhaps the solicitor's arrangements would be scrutinized, and perhaps nothing would be changed in a hurry, and perhaps I would have more time to make myself useful again, to remind her." She looked up. "It sounds very small when I say it aloud." "It sounds," Miss Marple said gently, "like the action of someone who was frightened and did not know quite how else to proceed, which is a very human thing to be." Mrs. Rutledge received this without the relief of someone who's been excused, and with something closer to the complicated feeling of someone who's been accurately understood. "And Mrs. Morton," Miss Marple said, turning the conversation by the smallest necessary degree, "you had no idea where she'd gone?" "None at all." Mrs. Rutledge met her eyes directly. "That part I did not arrange. That part I did not know." Miss Marple nodded and looked, for a moment at the dried flowers by the kitchen door, their faded colours warm in the morning light, their scent a last exhalation of a summer already past. She thought about the green leather box and the unstained fragment inside it. She thought about 2 attempted sales and 2 retreats, and a woman who had not been able to let go of a thing until perhaps she had finally found a way. "No," she said quietly, "I did not think you did." She finished her tea, declined a second piece of shortbread with genuine regret, and walked home through the late morning with the particular composed calm of someone in whom several parts of a thing have come to rest in their proper relation to one another, and who knows that the remaining parts are not far behind. Chapter 9. An explanation offered softly. There are moments in the course of a village mystery, if one may call it that, for the word sits somewhat grandly on an affair conducted entirely through conversation and parish records and the quiet observation of domestic detail, when the remaining facts arrange themselves with a readiness that suggests they have been waiting, in a patient and orderly fashion, for someone to collect them. Wednesday brought such a moment, and it arrived, as such moments often do in St. Mary Mead, over tea. Miss Marple had sent a note to Mrs. Rutledge that morning, brief and without explanation, asking whether she might call again at 3 o'clock, and requesting that Mrs. Rutledge extend the same invitation to Miss Bray. She had worded the note with sufficient vagueness that neither the purpose nor the implied gravity of the gathering would be apparent in advance. Experience had taught her that people arrive more honestly at a conversation when they have not had the opportunity to prepare extensively for it. Mrs. Rutledge had complied, though the note she had sent to Miss Bray must have contained some intimation of uncertainty, because Miss Bray arrived at 3 o'clock with the alert, slightly defensive composure of a woman who suspects she's about to be required to account for something, but has not yet determined precisely what. The sitting room was the same as it had been the previous morning, warm, slightly crowded, honest in its clutter. Mrs. Rutledge had produced a Victoria sponge that occupied the centre of the table, with a modesty entirely at odds with its quality. Miss Bray sat with her hands in her lap and her back admirably straight, and accepted a slice with the polite restraint of someone for whom appetite is currently secondary to attention. Miss Marple poured, which she had offered to do, and settled into her chair with the unhurried ease of a woman who has nowhere more pressing to be, and no particular anxiety about what she's about to say. She began with Mrs. Rutledge. "I think," she said, addressing them both equally, though her eyes rested at first on Mrs. Rutledge, "that it would be useful for Miss Bray to understand what you told me yesterday morning, not the whole of it. That is your own account and yours to share as you choose, but the essential fact, that the bundle of lace was not donated by Mrs. Morton, and that you were the person who placed it among the jumble sale items." Mrs. Rutledge, who had evidently spent the intervening 24 hours in serious reflection, said simply, "Yes, that is the case." Miss Bray looked at her with an expression that shifted in the space of several seconds, through surprise, reassessment, and something that might, with charitable interpretation, have been relief. Then Adelaide did not intend to give it away. "No," said Miss Marple, "I do not believe she did. Which brings us to the more interesting question, not what Mrs. Rutledge did, which we now understand, but what Mrs. Morton herself intended, before she left." She had spent the previous evening thinking this through with the patient thoroughness she brought to anything that required it, and the picture that had emerged was, she thought, sufficiently coherent to present, though she held it with the appropriate lightness of a reconstruction rather than a certainty. Mrs. Morton, she believed, had reached a decision some weeks prior to her departure. Not a sudden decision. Nothing about Mrs. Morton suggested sudden decisions, but one arrived at gradually, through the long process of a self-possessed woman conducting a private reckoning. The revision of her will, about which rumour had correctly informed the village, was part of it. The visit to Mr. and Garth had been real. What the revision contained was not Miss Marple's information to share, and she did not propose to speculate about it beyond what was necessary. What she did propose to consider was the veil. A woman who has spent the better part of her life keeping an object that she cannot bear to release and cannot bear to keep eventually reaches a point at which the matter must be settled, Miss Marple said, with the measured pace of someone who is finding the words as she goes, rather than reciting them. Mrs. Morton reached that point this summer. The question of her will brought her into direct consideration of what she wished to leave behind and in what condition, and among the things she had to consider was the veil. She had, Miss Marple believed, made a decision about it, not to put it in the sale, that had been tried twice and abandoned twice, and she was not a woman who repeated unsuccessful experiments, but to settle its history, in her own mind at least, and to put it away with understanding rather than irresolution. The cutting of the fragment and its placement in the green leather box was, Miss Marple thought, an act of that kind, a deliberate separation. The fragment preserved as a keepsake, the larger portion, perhaps, freed for another destination yet to be determined. She was not forgetful, Miss Marple said, glancing briefly at Miss Bray. She was in the process of concluding something, which is quite different. Miss Bray received this without flinching, and without pretending that the earlier suggestion of forgetfulness had been anything other than what it was. She was, Miss Marple had decided, an intelligent woman, and intelligent women rarely benefit from being spoken to as though they are not. And her absence, Miss Bray said, I think she left intentionally and quietly, because she required time and distance to complete what she had begun. A woman who has spent 20 years in a village is not always able to think clearly while still in it. People know one's routine, one's face, one's history. Sometimes one must simply remove oneself. Miss Marple spoke with the tone of someone drawing on personal knowledge of a general principle. She did not leave in distress. She left, I believe, in the particular relief of a person who has made up her mind. Mrs. Rutledge looked at the Victoria sponge with the expression of someone who would very much like to say something, and is deciding whether to say it. She said it. Then the lace, my putting it in the bundle, the whole of this week's worry. It was all unnecessary. The worry was unnecessary, Miss Marple agreed with great gentleness. The week itself was not without value, as several things have been understood that might otherwise have remained quite dark. This was offered not as consolation but as simple observation, and Mrs. Rutledge received it as such. The business of what was to be done now presented itself with the practical insistence of things that have been deferred long enough. It was, in the end, not complicated. The stained veil was in Mrs. Pell's keeping, and could remain so until Mrs. Morton's return, at which point it could be restored to her without the necessity of an explanation that would cause more discomfort than the situation warranted. The fragment in the green leather box was undisturbed. The letters on the card tray in the cottage hall were Adelaide Morton's private correspondence, and would wait for Adelaide Morton. Mrs. Rutledge's part in the matter was between Mrs. Rutledge and whatever judgment she applied to her own conduct, supplemented, if she chose, by a private conversation with Mrs. Morton upon her return. Miss Marple did not propose to arrange that conversation, or to anticipate its contents. People of good character, she had found, generally know what they owe to one another, even when they have temporarily lost sight of it. As for Miss Bray, she sat for a long moment after the principal explanation had concluded, her hands still in her lap, looking at the window with an expression of the careful candour of someone examining their own conduct, and not finding the examination entirely comfortable. I was not entirely honest, she said at last, to no one in particular, about what I was looking for in that cottage. No, Miss Marple agreed, without any particular emphasis. I did not think you were. I was afraid she had changed everything. Naturally, it is a frightening thing. Or to feel that something you have counted on may be reconsidered, she paused. Though security built upon another person's decisions is always somewhat provisional, however well-founded one's hopes may be, it is perhaps more comfortable to cultivate securities of one's own making. Miss Bray looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod that acknowledged the remark for what it was. Not a rebuke, exactly, but a considered observation offered to someone capable of making use of it. The tea was finished. The Victoria sponge was reduced to a single modest slice that Mrs. Rutledge pressed on Miss Marple, and which was accepted with the sincerity it deserved. The late afternoon light had taken on the amber quality that late summer afternoons in England achieve in their better moments, and it lay agreeably across the sitting-room carpet and the photographs on the mantelpiece and the open library book on the sofa arm. Miss Marple walked home through it, thinking of nothing in particular and everything in general, which was, she had long ago discovered, the most productive possible use of a fine Wednesday evening. She rather thought that Mrs. Morton would return before the week was out. Chapter 10. After the fabric is washed. Mrs. Morton returned on Friday. She arrived by the midday bus from Milverley, carrying a small leather travelling case of the kind that suggests a journey of deliberate rather than extended duration, and she walked from the bus stop to Wisteria Lane at her usual measured pace, which was the pace of a woman who has never found it necessary to hurry, and does not propose to begin now. She had, by her own subsequent account, been staying with an old friend near the Dorset coast, a friendship of some 40 years' standing, conducted largely by correspondence, and visited so rarely that its resumption in person required a period of comfortable readjustment that she had found, on the whole, thoroughly beneficial. She was surprised to find her doorstep clear of milk bottles, which Mrs. Rutledge had been collecting since Monday, in an act of neighbourly maintenance that also, it must be said, served the secondary purpose of providing a reason to be seen on Wisteria Lane at regular intervals. She was rather more surprised upon entering her cottage and finding everything precisely as she had left it. The shawl folded, the spectacles on the open devotional book, the letters on the card tray awaiting postage, to be informed when she called upon Mrs. Rutledge that same afternoon to collect the accumulated milk and to announce her return, that the village had spent the better part of a week in a state of mild but sustained agitation on her behalf. Miss Marple heard of her return from Mrs. Fellows, who had it from the wool shop, and she called at Wisteria Cottage on Saturday morning with a small pot of gooseberry preserve in the manner of someone making an entirely ordinary neighbourly visit. Mrs. Adelaide Morton received her in the sitting-room with the composed, attentive warmth of a woman who had been told something of the week's events, and wished, in her own careful way, to understand them better. She was a handsome woman, seen close, with the particular quality of those who have been still featured in youth and become in age the more interesting for it. Fine-boned, clear-eyed, with white hair dressed with the careful simplicity of someone who has long since ceased to perform for anyone's benefit but her own. She poured tea from a pot that had clearly been warming in anticipation, which suggested that the visit was not entirely unexpected, and she listened to Miss Marple's account of the week with the focused, unhurried attention of a person receiving information that concerns them personally and intend to receive it accurately. Miss Marple gave the account honestly, though with the discretion appropriate to what was, in the end, a private matter that had briefly and involuntarily become a public one. She described the discovery of the lace at the parish hall. She described the general concern that had arisen from Mrs. Morton's absence. She described, with rather more care and rather less detail, Mrs. Rutledge's part in the affair, its motive, its mechanism, and its essential character as an act of anxiety rather than malice. Mrs. Morton listened to this last portion without interruption, and sat for a moment afterward in a silence of the thoughtful rather than the troubled kind. "I see," she said, which was all she said immediately, but which carried in it the full weight of a woman who does indeed see, and who is deciding what to do with what she sees. She was afraid, Miss Marple said gently, of being forgotten. It is a fear that visits most people at some point, and which some people manage more gracefully than others. Mrs. Rutledge has not always managed it gracefully, but I think she knows that. "Ivy has been very good to me," Mrs. Morton said, with a directness that was its own form of generosity. "Whatever she did this week, that remains true." Miss Marple nodded, and said nothing further on the subject, because there was nothing further that needed saying. Some things, she had long ago observed, resolve themselves most cleanly when the person most concerned is simply given the relevant information and left to attend to it in their own manner. Mrs. Morton was precisely the sort of woman who could be relied upon for this. The veil was the easier matter in some respects, and the more interesting one in others. When Miss Marple mentioned that Mrs. Pell had been keeping it in safekeeping, and that it might now be returned, Mrs. Morton gave a small, quiet smile that had in it something of the rueful and something of the settled. "I had been thinking about it for some time," she said, and there was in her voice the slight release of tension that accompanies the public naming of a private thing. What to do with it finally? My aunt left it to my mother, and my mother could never quite decide, and it came to me in that same state of irresolution. It is a very fine piece, but its history is not a happy one, and I found I could neither display it nor release it. She paused and looked at the window, and then at her hands. I went to Dorset partly to think clearly, which I find difficult here, as I suspect most people find difficult in a place where they are well known, and I believe I have arrived at a decision. She looked at Miss Marple with the directness of a woman who has reached a conclusion and intends to act on it. The larger portion of the veil will go to the County Museum in Milverley. I have already written to inquire about the process. A piece of that quality deserves to be properly preserved and occasionally admired, which it cannot be in a cedar chest. The fragment in the green box I shall keep. As a keepsake, Miss Marple said. As a keepsake, Mrs. Morton confirmed, of my aunt, who deserves to be remembered by something other than a broken engagement and a piece of fabric too fine for ordinary use. This seemed to Miss Marple both entirely right and rather moving, though she expressed neither of these assessments aloud. She drank her tea and remarked sincerely that the cottage garden was looking very well for the time of year which it was. The bloodstained corner, she inquired, since it was a detail worth completing. Did Mrs. Morton know its origin? A small accident with a rose thorn, Mrs. Morton said, with the calm certainty of a woman stating a fact rather than constructing an explanation. In the summer of 1903, when I took the veil from my mother's house for the auction, I cut my finger handling it, and the blood fell on the corner before I'd noticed. I blotted what I could, but it had already been absorbed. Old linen is very porous. She looked faintly amused. I imagine it has given rise to considerable speculation this week. Some, Miss Marple acknowledged with matching composure. The conversation moved as conversations between two composed women of a certain age and considerable mutual respect will move through other quieter matters, the garden, the proposed new arrangement of the church hall furniture, the unreliability of the summer weather. It had the comfortable quality of a visit between people who do not need to impress one another, and have found the absence of that necessity rather pleasant. As Miss Marple was preparing to leave, Mrs. Morton said, with the careful plainness of someone raising a thing that has been sitting in the room throughout, but had been left alone out of courtesy, the matter of my will, I imagine that too has become a subject of interest. Somewhat, Miss Marple said. I revised it before I left. It is now as I wished it to be. She said nothing further, and Miss Marple did not ask. What a woman does with her own estate is her own affair, and the interest that others take in it is their own responsibility to manage. She walked back through the village in the clear Friday air. It was Saturday, she corrected herself, and the days having blurred somewhat over a week of unusual activity, and past the parish hall which stood quiet and unremarkable in the morning light, its jumble sale utility entirely discharged for another year. The trestle tables were gone from the window, the door was locked. A notice on the board announced harvest arrangements. She thought, as she walked, about fabric and about memory and about the things that people preserve past the point of usefulness, because they have not yet found a way to honour them adequately enough to let them go. She thought about the small green box and the unstained fragment inside it, and about a museum in Milverley that would shortly receive a piece of Belgian lace with a scalloped border and a complicated history, and would display it in time behind glass, where people who knew nothing of its past might admire it simply for what it was. That seemed on the whole the right resolution. At home, the roses wanted attention, and the second glove was nearly finished, and the afternoon had that particular quality of early August stillness that asks nothing of the person sitting in it except the